Okay, I think we can get started now. Good evening or good afternoon, wherever you happen to be logging in from. My name is Christine Schmidt, and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London. We are very pleased to welcome you to tonight's event, our virtual talk with Caroline Sturdy-Colls and Kevin Colls, authors of Adolf Island, the Nazi Occupation of Alderney, as part of our new academic book series. Adolf Island offers new forensic archaeological and spatial perspectives on the Nazi forced and slave labor program that was initiated on the Channel Island of Alderney during its occupation in the Second World War. Drawing on extensive archival research and the results of the first in-field investigations of the quote-unquote crime scenes since 1945, the book identifies and characterizes the network of concentration and labor camps, fortifications, burial sites, and other material traces connected to the occupation, providing new insights into the identities and experiences of the men and women who lived, worked, and died within this landscape. The book is the culmination of 10 years research carried out by Staffordshire University forensic archaeologists, Professor Caroline Sturdy-Colls and Associate Professor Kevin Colls. Their investigations on the island have also been the subject of a TV documentary that was screened on the Smithsonian Channel in 2019. Moving beyond previous studies focused on military aspects of the occupation, the book argues that Alderney was intrinsically linked to wider systems of Nazi forced and slave labor. But before I introduce our speakers, just a few notes of our usual housekeeping. You will be kept on mute during the entire program, but please enter your questions via the chat. After we hear from our speakers, we will have time to take as many questions as we can. I'm also using the auto captioning feature, but please note that this is automated, so it doesn't always reflect the speaker's words accurately. You can turn this on and off at the bottom of your screen. This program is also being recorded for the library's YouTube channel, but your camera will not appear in the recording. If you have any technical issues, please feel free to send me or my colleague Martina a message, and we'll try to help you out. Now to our speakers. Caroline Sturdy-Colls is a professor of conflict archaeology and genocide investigation at Staffordshire University, specializing in Holocaust studies. She is also the research lead and founder of the Center of Archaeology at the same institution. Her research focuses on the application of interdisciplinary approaches to the investigation of Holocaust landscapes, with a particular focus on forensic and archaeological techniques and the ethical issues that surround their implementation. She has undertaken archaeological investigations at Treblinka, extermination and labor camps in Poland, the sites pertaining to the slave labor program in Alderney, the former Samlen Judenlager and Anhaltlager in Serbia, Bergen-Belsen, Germany, and numerous killing sites in Poland and Ukraine. Kevin Colls is an associate professor of archaeology and is the lead archaeological project manager for the Center of Archaeology at Staffordshire University. He has directed and published archaeological projects throughout Europe and has over 20 years of experience in professional development-led archaeology. Kevin has directed several fieldwork projects at Holocaust sites, most recently in Ukraine. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Caroline and Kevin.
Thank you very much, Christine. And on behalf of Kevin and I'd just like to thank you at the Wiener Holocaust Library for hosting this event and for your support of our projects over the years, and also to all of you in the audience for joining us this evening. I'll start with a reading of two profiles of two people who formed the very beginning of our book, as I feel it's very important, first of all, to share their stories. Volodymyr Zayats, a Ukrainian citizen born in Boromlia, was one of millions of victims of Nazi persecution during World War II. An electrician by training, Zayats was first sent to Dachau concentration camp in Germany as a protective custody prisoner on the 18th of July, 1942. After a short period of release, he was transferred to Neuengamme concentration camp near Hamburg on the 14th of December. But Zayats was not murdered in either of these now notorious SS-run concentration camps. Instead, on the 5th of April, 1943, he was shot by his SS overseers just 1 month after arriving at Silt, a Nazi concentration camp on the island of Alderney. He has no known grave. Burial in an unmarked grave on Alderney was a fate shared with 18-year-old Archip Alexienko. Having been recruited in his hometown of Piaski, Alexienko was sent to Alderney to undertake heavy construction work under the control of the Todd organization, also known as the OT, a civil and military engineering unit tasked with supporting the Nazi forced labor program. On the 8th of November 1942, following just 3 months of incarceration, this time in a labor camp called Norderney, He died of cachexia, a condition that involves weakness and muscle wastage of the body, resulting from poor living and working conditions that he endured. These men were just two of several thousand labourers who were sent to Alderney, or Adolf Island as it was codenamed, after this small island 60 miles from the British coast and 8 miles from France was occupied by the Germans. They were also among several hundred who perished and who remain missing persons. The occupation itself began on the 2nd of July 1940, 1 week after the island's 1,432 of the inhabitants were evacuated to mainland Britain. These events followed the decision by Winston Churchill that the Channel Islands were too expensive and too difficult to defend. The occupation would last until the 16th of May 1945. Between 1941 and 1945, thousands of labourers were sent to the island to build vast concrete fortifications, which historians have suggested were designed to assist Hitler's plan to make Alderney into an impregnable fortress and a stepping stone from which the Germans could potentially invade mainland Britain. In March 1942, these fortifications became part of the Atlantic Wall after Hitler ordered the defence of the entire coastline from Norway to the French border with Spain. Hence, both above and below the ground, Alderney was radically altered. Green fields and quaint buildings were transformed by the presence of vast concrete megastructures, minefields and military equipment in order to protect against even the strongest attempt at landing. And Alderney became what Ghaccari and Mintzer have described as one of several Nazi grand geographies. As the population of Alderney had departed, the Germans were also free to make use of the houses, businesses, fields, transport facilities, and personal possessions that they'd left behind. Previously unassuming buildings and fields were transformed into labour and concentration camps to house the labourers, such as the concentration camp at Silt that you can see here on the left-hand side, and the labour camp at Norderney on the right. This included other camps such as Helgoland and Borkum, and some of these locations also became killing sites. We will, of course, discuss the various experiences of the internees in much more detail later, but it's important to say at this point that the vast majority of labourers sent to Alderney suffered from ill treatment in the form of poor living and working conditions, beatings, and a lack of food under the government's governance of both the organisation Todd and the SS. For many, as we will show later, ill health, disease, or injury, accidental or murderously inflicted by their overseers, meant that Alderney became their final resting place. The events on Alderney had a dramatic impact on the lives of the people sent to Alderney and on its landscape, as I've already stated. Therefore, the main aim of our book, Adolf Island, the Nazi Occupation of Alderney, was twofold. Firstly, to refocus attention on the stories of the forced and slave labourers sent to Alderney, and then to demonstrate how the complex landscape forged by the Germans impacted upon their lives, work, and death. This was necessary for several reasons. Firstly, although investigations by the British government did take place after the war, as we will discuss in more detail later, these resulted in an official history of the occupation, which ultimately downplayed the crimes perpetrated, designated all of the labourers as Russians, and ignored claims about mass graves and higher numbers of deaths made by witnesses. Second, although historians have afforded the occupation of Alderney some attention, with a few notable exceptions, most texts have focused on the military history of World War II. Thus, the labourers and the more uncomfortable aspects of the occupation have been glossed over or omitted altogether. Third, the sites pertaining to the occupation remain largely unmarked and unprotected, their landscapes revealing little about the camps, burial sites, and workplaces that existed there. And so until we began our work, these sites had never been examined archaeologically. Thus, much more important evidence has been lost, and much more remains at risk. Finally, new archaeological methods plus the declassification of documents around the world meant that it was possible to revisit the history of the occupation, to examine the archaeological evidence connected to these events, and to foreground spatial readings of archival sources. I'll now hand over to Kevin to describe a little bit more about our methodology.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So as Nicholas Waxman has argued, to imagine the past, we must unfreeze it. And compiling this book, that was our main aim. So our research began in 2008, and our first fieldwork season was in 2010, and we've been regularly returning to the island of Alderney ever since. Over the course of the next decade, we carried out extensive historical and archaeological research that addressed many unanswered questions connected to the camps and work sites on the island, and also the burial sites. Drawing on our own research and sub-discipline of Holocaust archaeology and forensic archaeological methods, we've approached the sites connected to the forced and slave labourers as crime scenes, a strategy that opened up new avenues and opportunities for more precise investigation and analysis of the violence and the murders and the clandestine burials that were carried out by the occupiers. What started as an archaeological investigation turned into a large-scale missing persons case and a review of the detailed history of the occupation. We also drew upon sensory archaeological theory and methods to understand the impact that the places connected to the forced and slave labourers had on the people who was experiencing these places. Our first stage of work is the collation of archival sources, both primary and secondary. So within the remit of forensic archaeology, this is called a desk-based assessment. So in this, we collect as many archive materials as we can find by visiting as many places around the globe as possible, to include the collection of aerial photographs, maps and sketches, witness testimony, photographs, both contemporary and modern, and anything we can find in like intelligence reports and letters. So these are our first starting point of any investigation. So here are some of the archives that we visited. We visited these more than once and tried to identify some important missing records. So in terms of this list here, to name a few of the more important ones, the UK National Archives, the International Tracing Service, various archives in Ukraine and Russia proved essential. And on top of the more global archives, we also visited the local archives in the Channel Islands, both on Alderney, Jersey and Guernsey. We also found the National Collection of Aerial Photography most informative and useful with our investigation. So once the desk-based part of any research project is complete, we then move on to more field-based investigations. And that started with numerous types of technological advancements within archaeology. So here on the screen is some examples of LiDAR and photogrammetry, which we use to create digital terrain models of the current landscape, as well as aerial images and 3D models, which we could then relate to the ancient topography and landscape that was around at the time of the occupation. These techniques could also identify structures and archaeology that's on the surface but is obscured by vegetation, and that's what we used these for. We also completed work with GPS, digital global positioning systems and total stations to record the topography at these sites, again looking for things that were buried beneath the ground that affects the visible surface, so above ground features that we record with these things and create topographic two-dimensional plans. Which takes us to geophysical survey, which is many different types of geophysical survey exist. They all have something in common, and that is they are identifying buried remains. So here, these techniques can identify, without the need to excavate, anomalies which may well represent buried remains beneath the subsurface. So that includes buried structures, but also graves, pits, and any other man-made and natural features in the landscape. And then finally, we brought together all this material, this archaeological and archival material together, and integrated it into three-dimensional maps and plans of the site. We used to create visualizations, hosting on not only our website, but many other websites as well. And it's all associated with the comparison between the old archival documents with our new archaeological data. And it's the analysis of those two things put together which makes the results in our book something which hasn't been actually done before. So now I'm going to take you back to Caroline, and she will talk through some of the key questions that we hoped our book will answer. Thank you.
Apologies for the same, the seat swapping, I should say, as well. It's unusual that two speakers, I guess, are in the same house. By viewing Alderney's occupation through a spatial and forensic archaeological lens, we set out to address some of the biggest questions concerning this period, and ones which remain the most controversial. So firstly, what was the true nature of the forced and slave labour programme on Alderney? Who was sent there and why? And crucially, how many people died on the island? Who are they? How did they die and where are they buried? In order to draw conclusions about these topics and to provide a more comprehensive history of the period, it was also necessary for us to address several other key questions. So why did the Nazis fortify Alderney? And did they really intend to use it as a launchpad to invade mainland Britain, as historians had previously suggested? What form did the camps on Alderney take, and how did they function? How did these camps fit into the wider Nazi camp system across Europe? And was what was going on Alderney simply unique to that island environment? What was known about the events of the occupation in its aftermath, and why were the perpetrators not brought to justice? And how have these reactions influenced the landscape and cultural memory in the years since? Obviously, time doesn't permit us to provide the answers to all of these questions this evening. However, we'd like to now share with you some of the major findings of our study. Again, this will be very much a summary. We're happy to take any questions at the end. And of course, would all strongly encourage you to obviously read the book if you're interested in any more of these topics that we'll touch on. So firstly, our study definitely demonstrated that the inmate demographic on Alderney was much more diverse than had been suggested in most post-war literature. Often in post-war literature, the labourers were described as Russian. This was a term that was first used by the Germans themselves and then was carried over for use by the British investigators who came to the island in May 1945. In reality, these so-called Russian inmates were in fact from Ukraine, Poland, Russia, Belarus, and from other Soviet-occupied territories. But the actual demographic of people on Alderney actually comprised of people from around 30 countries who came from a diverse range of backgrounds. While some of these individuals were recruited into the labour programme voluntarily, most were, if they were recruited, would recruited under duress. And others were incarcerated because they were classed as political opponents, criminals, or Jews. Hence, the Labour programme on Alderney fulfilled another purpose, removing and punishing so-called enemies of the Third Reich. Many of those who were seen as volunteers, for example, as well in post-war accounts, were either falsely promised a better life through mass recruitment drives. So the example you can see here on the slide is a newspaper in Kostopil in Ukraine, where Ukrainians were encouraged to, quote, to use your chance to earn higher wages by working for the Germans, which of course they never in fact received. Or they were threatened with death if they didn't go and work for the German Labour programme. So having seen what happened to their families back home, many of these men subsequently signed up to work, for example, for the organisation Todd. There were also many Soviet POWs present in both the organisation Todd and SS camps in Alderney. They were initially sent to regular camps elsewhere in Europe after they'd supposedly committed a crime in a prisoner of war camp. So thus they, even though they were Soviet POWs and should have been treated in a particular way by the Germans, the fact that they then ended up in regular camps meant that they could be treated exactly the same as the other forced enslaved labourers, and thus were subject to terrible atrocities. And of course, the German perceptions of Soviet POWs was to treat them as inferior beings, and they suffered harsh treatment, therefore, consistent with Nazi policy against people from Eastern Europe in general as well. There were many Jewish prisoners who were held on Alderney. Many of these are often described in literature as French Jews. Many of them were from France, many of them had French citizenship, but they also came from many other places, such as Haim Parsimento, who you can see on the screen here, who was born in Turkey, and Theodor Hanel, who was born in the Lower Rhine to a Jewish family, and then he lived elsewhere in France later on and during the war. And other prisoners included Spaniards, German political prisoners, including members of the so-called 999 Penal Brigade, which was for members of the German military who'd been subject to prison sentences. There were also Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma people, and arrested Channel Islanders in the camp, as well as Spanish Republicans, whose only choice was either to sign up to work for organisation Todd or return to Franco Spain, where they were considered enemies of the state. We also were very keen to stress in the book that Alderney was one node in the labourers' journeys through the Nazi camp system. This wasn't an isolated event that these people had found themselves in camps. Many of the internees on Alderney had in fact spent time in many other camps in Europe, such as Dachau, Sachsenhausen and Neuengamme, in deplorable conditions. And what we found in witness testimonies that many in fact said that Alderney was worse and that they actually suffered worse treatment there. And in many cases, many prisoners who'd survived terrible atrocities in these camps subsequently went on to die in Alderney as a result of the treatment they received, which we'll come back to later. The number of inmates on the island we also found was higher than reported in post-war reports. Although British investigators sent to the island immediately after liberation stated that 4,000 labourers had been sent to the island, our research has shown that a minimum of 6,600 forced slave and less than slave labourers were interned from 1942 onwards. And you can see on the table here some of the major transports of those prisoners, large groups of Eastern European workers who were sent to the island, for example, between March and August 1942, and the Jewish transports, French Jews from France. You can see several of those here happening between August and October 1943, making up the largest numbers of the prisoner demographic. But it's important to say that the overall number of people sent to the island was undoubtedly higher than this, because details concerning the number of Jews, North African prisoners, and French and Belgian labourers in particular before the summer of 1942 are very scarce. And we also don't have detailed transport lists in many cases, because these were destroyed by the Germans. There were also more than 100 volunteer labourers from France, Belgium, and Portugal who were true volunteers who were paid a wage, and they were also present on the island. So this is our conservative minimum number of labourers at this time. Our work has also shown that a complex landscape of camps and incarceration sites were created across Alderney during the occupation, in which forced slave and less than slave labourers endured a diverse range of conditions, reflecting their perceived status by the Nazi regime. And it's important to state that Alderney is only 3.5 miles by 1.5 miles in length and width. And so these are a large number of camps feature on this very small island. And historical and archaeological research has demonstrated that the number of sites created far exceeded the main named camps of Borkum, Helgoland, Silt, and Norderney, which were widely known about before our study. In total, at least 13 camps existed across Alderney's length and breadth, and these consisted variably of purpose-built camps comprising of prefabricated huts through to houses that were surrounded by barbed wire. And in addition, Alderney's prison continued to act as a place of incarceration, both for court-martialed German military personnel on the island and for labourers accused of criminal activity. And so by making use of existing infrastructure, the Germans were able to successfully implement a penal system throughout the occupation as well. And sites such as farms, forts, and other existing buildings were also used as internment sites, bringing the total number of places used to house labourers to more than 20, as you can see on the screen here. And some examples of these smaller camps are shown here on the slide. The image on the top left shows a camp for political prisoners built on a road called Clos de Mer, construction of which began by March 1942. So this is just prior to the arrival of large numbers of Eastern European workers. This camp was located next to a sawmill at which forced labourers were also employed. And the surviving gateposts of this camp we were able to locate, and they're shown in the image at the top right of your screen there. Another example of a camp off La Balie was also built in March 1942 and was later used to house North African prisoners in early 1944. And you can see that at the bottom there. It's now a holiday campsite, but the buildings, although they look like camp buildings, are actually not original and are not placed on the original camp footings. This we were able to discern from comparison with aerial photographs. Given the size of the island, the number of camps and incarceration sites that we've described might initially appear very high, even if we consider the fact that more than 6,600 labourers were sent there. However, an examination of the positioning of these camps offers something of an explanation regarding why so many were built. The distribution of the camps and incarceration sites across the island in part reflects, one, the need or desire to use existing buildings before purpose-built camps could be created, and this was particularly true throughout 1941 before large contingents of labourers arrived to help build the camps that they would later live in. Secondly, the need for accommodation near to specific building projects or labour activities as the fortification programme developed. So initially the camps were built at the four corners of the island, for example, the main camps, and close to other projects. Later, actually prisoners were marched from one end of the island from the camp they were in to a work site at the other as a form of punishment. But initially they were built in specific areas for convenience. And thirdly, there was a desire to segregate and often punish different groups of labourers. So some were specifically built, for example, for to contain areas with French Jews in them, others as the one I've already mentioned, to contain North African prisoners. And so as we further illustrate in the book, this approach was common throughout Nazi-occupied Europe in relation to the housing of labourers and prisoners under German control. So I'll now hand back to Kevin to speak about some of the other camps.
Thank you. So in addition to the smaller network of camps that Caroline has just spoken about, we did a substantial period of research on the main camps on the island, so Helgeland, Silt, Borkum and Longy Common. So as you can see on the map in front of you, they are Borkum and Nordney on the map in front of you. So as you can see, they are positioned roughly in the four corners of the island, and they are placed specifically at locations that had a lot of work and construction and fortification that was needed. So that's why they were placed there. So the first sort of results that we concluded was to complete archival research, as previously noted, the assessment of aerial photographs and witness testimony and comparing the two, and then adding to that our own archaeological survey of these sites. We've managed to create the first maps and evolution of each of the four main camps that brings together this historical and archaeological data. So some examples relating to Helgeland and Nordney camps are shown here on the screen. And crucially, we have created multiple camps of the same site from different periods of the occupation. So how do they evolve over time? Which buildings were built in what order? And therefore, this analysis and the impact that these changes had on the prisoners and the lives of the prisoners that were held in these locations, and the way that their architecture was influenced by shifts in Nazi policy. This was particularly important work because, as you can see on the screen in front of you now, the camps were demolished by the Germans immediately after the war and are now used in a variety of ways by the island at the moment. So that ranges from a housing estate, the campsite, right through to being housed on derelict waste ground near the airport. So all of these camps are in extremely different, unprotected states at the moment. So if we move on to providing one more in-depth example of lager silt, the image on the screen shows the evolution of silt from its conception as a labour camp, that's A, through to the time of as it being a concentration camp. So you can see here the dramatic increase in the numbers of buildings. Even though this camp was initially consisted of 5 buildings and housed around 200 labourers, survivor testimony suggests that everyone was actually afraid of this camp, even when it was an OT administered camp. Whilst it was previously assumed that the camp was only enlarged when the SS arrived in March 1943, our analysis of aerial images has shown that in fact it was expanded much earlier, suggesting that more labourers were sent there. The camp was in fact not complete when the SS arrived in March 1943, and an inmate suggested that the incoming prisoners had to effectively build their own prison. This resulted in an enlarged complex of around 25 buildings, which you see on the screen there as C. At Silt, we also undertook a series of archaeological methodologies like I've spoken about previously. We used LiDAR surveys to identify buried remains beneath the undergrowth. And we also identified walkover survey, which found subtle traces in the landscape of the boundaries of the camp, the guard positions. We also found a second entrance, or evidence for a second entrance, where 4 fellow inmates were dragged outside the camp through a small gate in a barbed wire fence. So now that ties together that witness testimony to the archaeological evidence that is still in existence at this site. We also located hidden structures under vegetation, which we were able to reveal during one season of fieldwork. So here you see picture A, the toilet block, which revealed sort of information about the terrible sanitary conditions in the camp and also the cramped living conditions in the barracks. We also, the next important part of our results was that the fortifications themselves that these prisoners were building should be viewed as the product of forced and slave labour. So as individual and collective structures and traces, the fortifications, the raw materials and objects that were being created during this occupation of Alderney owe their very existence to this exploitation and the suffering of those who were forced to make them. So we argue throughout the book that they should be viewed as the products of slave labour. The workers and their overseers and the German personnel stationed on Alderney had complex relationships and interactions with the landscape itself, both the natural and the artificial. So these interactions shaped the nature of their daily lives, variably contributing to or easing the sense of control, fear, violence, monotony, and enjoyment felt by certain individuals on the island, and often resulting in a sensory assault on the prisoners' senses through sounds, smells, and the sights that they were experiencing on a daily basis. Many of the fortification sites became deathscapes, as people perished during the course of the work that they were being asked to do, particularly at sites like shown on the screen, West Battery. It's seen as one of the most dangerous places, and if you're a prisoner working there, it was almost certain death. So I'll now pass to Caroline.
As we mentioned, we were very keen to stress the labourers' stories, and I think some of the most pertinent discoveries we found in the field were the subtle marks that the labourers left of their own existence, either deliberately or accidentally. And these traces provide important insights into their experiences and also proof of life, as many people, of course, sadly perished on the island, or if not on the island, during their return to mainland Europe and other camps. So, for example, we found 49 names of forced slave and less than slave labourers etched into the concrete or brick at the work sites that they were sent to. And this then led us to obviously map these archaeologically, to record them high definition photography, for example, and then to undertake detailed searches in the records of the International Tracing Service and also the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's database of Holocaust victims and survivors. And important details about the lives of these labourers were then recovered. Obviously, we don't have time to go through them all, but one particular pertinent example you can see here in the top left was an inscription that said, "Here worked Kostya Belyaev, 1944." Obviously, this person wanting to quite literally state that they were present on Alderney. And we were able to find out that Kostya Belyaev was an SS concentration camp inmate on Alderney from March 1943 until the end of June 1944, so would have been housed in Silt concentration camp. He was transferred to Solstedt on the 12th of September 1944 to work in a potash mine after he was deported to Alderney with those SS Bau Brigade 1, those SS concentration camp inmates who did survive their time on Alderney. And he was then registered in Buchenwald on the 22nd of September 1944 with the prisoner number 88069. And we have many other stories, quite luckily, of these individuals from the inscriptions. And actually, we did find that many of those who made these inscriptions did, in fact, survive their time on Alderney as well. One of our major findings that I'd like to spend a little bit of time on now relates to the death and burial system on Alderney. Again, I'm going to have to provide very much a summary here, given in the interest of time. But it's fair to say that the death and burial system on Alderney was much more chaotic than it appeared. And deliberate attempts were made to hide the causes of deaths, the numbers of deaths, and the locations of burials on the island. So, for example, on the face of it, OT and SS prisoners, when they died, had death certificates prepared for them. However, our research has shown when we've looked into this further that in reality, the causes of deaths of these inmates were often standardised. They were often listed as heart failure or some sort of lung disease when a doctor had never even seen these bodies. And many of these people probably didn't even die from those conditions. And this was likely an attempt to hide the true causes of death. And certainly we know of people who were supposedly shot who had those standard listings on their death certificate. Death certificates were also often prepared in batches, some time after people had died, and the dead were often not buried either for some time after death. So therefore misidentifications occurred, and there are certainly many inconsistencies between the records. Many death certificates appear not to have been created at all, and many were of course destroyed by the Germans in attempts to hide their crimes. And again, this we know from our archival research. Similarly, if somebody perished on Alderney, in theory, they should have been buried in one of two cemeteries for the forced and slave labourers. So one existed in St Anne's Churchyard in the main town on Alderney, and the other existed on Longy Common. And historical and archaeological research has demonstrated really that again, this system, though, was incredibly chaotic. So the graves were supposedly marked with crosses, and this led to the British investigators and also then subsequently later the German War Graves Commission to coming up with an official figure of 389 deaths. And this followed exhumations by them under the terms of the Anglo-German War Graves Agreement in 1961. And so that's the kind of narrative that's been in existence since the end of the war, that these 389 total, the sum total of people who perished on the island. And claims of mass graves and other clandestine body disposal methods have certainly circulated since the end of World War II, but have been definitely met with scepticism, have often been denied, and generally it's assumed, because of the apparent order of these cemeteries, that everybody was buried when they died in a dignified way. However, again, we've demonstrated through the research that this is simply not the case. If people were buried in these two locations, as they should have been, then our research has shown that graves were marked, but then they were often unmarked and remarked again at various points throughout the occupation, as the German authorities told the local camp commandants on Alderney to improve the condition of the burial sites, and they complained even about the high numbers of deaths. So markers were taken down, they were burned, they were put back up again in different places. And so when the British arrived in May 1945 to document the cemetery, the markers they encountered didn't pertain to the graves on which they sat in most cases, and they themselves, even at that point, found a number of unmarked burials, showing that the system was, as I said, very chaotic. We've also uncovered a range of evidence that shows that rather than being planned resting places for the forced slave and less than slave labourers, these cemeteries actually were just token burial sites, which were designed to give the impression of order. And again, we see the cemetery only appearing after a commission from Berlin came to the island to complain about the chaotic nature of deaths. And then suddenly we see rows of graves, we see fences emerging, and we see supposed order when in fact we're dealing with a time of chaos. Despite claims after the war as well by the British government and in the official histories of the occupation that no evidence of mass graves have ever been found on Alderney, our research first demonstrated that a mass grave thought to contain the bodies of 43 unknown Russians was in fact marked by British liberators in 1945 with the cross that you can see on the right-hand side here and an accompanying description. And it was photographed and recorded by the Imperial War Graves Commission in 1952. And then the marker said he lay the bodies of 43 unknown Soviet citizens. The existence of this grave we've then subsequently been able to confirm by the analysis of aerial images, archaeological survey, and in particular geophysical investigation. So as shown in the image here, the mass grave, I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but you can see on the annotation it's marked as feature 9, is a cleared area of possible mass grave, was visible on aerial photos from October 1943. Also our investigations have shown a number of other burial areas outside the cemetery, which I'll come on to shortly, and a series later of individual interments that were placed over the top of this apparent mass grave later on during the occupation. And historical and archaeological research has provided convincing evidence, therefore, that some individuals must lie in other unmarked graves and interment sites across Alderney. Given the chaotic nature of the burial practices, the incomplete nature of exhumation methods employed in the 1960s, and witness testimony supported by archaeological survey, it's very clear that some of the missing are likely located in and around the official cemeteries of Longy Common, and to a lesser extent in St Anne as well. And we can see here, we've done various aerial photograph analysis. We can see the areas of the mass grave, as I said, has 13 individual graves being buried over the top of it later on. This is the image you can see here on the right, feature 13. So we believe this could be another attempt to hide the existence of this mass grave. And we also see in later images from March 1944 and then in June 1944, two large areas outside of the cemetery boundaries where these areas of disturbance look consistent with unmarked burials. Again, this adds credence to the idea that these cemeteries were show cemeteries, given the fence being put up to give the impression that there was an ordered area of burial, when in fact clandestine graves were being created elsewhere. This, as I've mentioned, was confirmed by our ground penetrating radar survey, and this demonstrated to us that the area of the mass grave that was marked by the British in 1945 appears to remain undisturbed. It appears as a linear trench in the ground penetrating radar data. So this is marked A in the two images on the right hand side of your screen. And whereas the individual interments above it and elsewhere, the other grave rows, as I mentioned, were exhumed in the 1960s. So coupled with the fact that we've identified several other locations of disturbance within the cemetery itself, for example, under a rifle range mound, and the fact that we know that the 1960s exhumations were not very thorough, we strongly believe that there is an unmarked mass grave within the cemetery, two possible areas outside of the cemetery as well, containing mass and individual burials. And so obviously there are important questions raised here over the protection of this site, which currently is an area of wasteland with no marker on it, indicating the former function of this particular site. And we also noted several other possible locations across the island as well, from witness testimonies, from intelligence maps that were collected by the British government in 1945, for example, and in the vicinity of other camps, some of the other OT camps, for example, that were constructed across the island that appear consistent with areas of disturbance that may indicate the presence of other burials. And so within the remit of our study, we weren't able to examine all of those in the field other than site visits, but we've got aerial photograph evidence that we present in the book, as well as various maps, plans and intelligence information. So obviously there are areas on the island that are worthy of further archaeological investigation in the future to confirm the locations of these potential graves. And in addition, to return again to the main aim of the book, we were keen not just to count numbers, we were keen to talk about the victims as individuals, and we present a number of profiles in the book of both living and deceased victims to share their stories. But we've been able to crucially name a number of missing persons on Alderney for the first time. So as I mentioned, there's been a lot of speculation about the number of deaths on the island. Some of these deaths are very easy to prove. We have a lot of evidence, some, less so because we have sporadic witness testimony about them. But what we've been able to do significantly is to actually name 84 missing persons, because we know from their death certificates that they certainly died on the island, but they have no marked graves. Or we have witnesses who saw their bodies and maybe even carried their bodies to the burial sites themselves, or we have other documents confirming their deaths. So we've included in the book very detailed information about their lives on the island, but also before they came to Alderney as well. And many of these inmates, it turns out, were actually shot, supposedly trying to escape, as the Germans called it, or they died in some other terrible circumstances. We also believe that a minimum of 701 people died during the occupation. Again, this is a very conservative estimate based on the numbers of deaths that we can prove, based on burial records, death certificates and the like. It's highly likely, in fact, that should be increased to at least 986, because we do have multiple witnesses who talk about several mass executions that took place on the island. And these are fairly convincing because they come from people who didn't know each other, who never met each other, necessarily in some cases after the war, yet they were reporting on the same things. And so when the number of bodies found during the exhumations in the 1960s are deducted from those totals, then we have between 312 and 597 people who perished on Alderney who've never been found. And obviously, I've already mentioned a number of burial sites that could potentially contain their remains. Obviously, again, these are minimum. We're very conscious to give conservative estimates that we can prove, and we're very clear in the book that these are conservative minimum estimates, because we know the potential for further deaths is evident. We know many records were destroyed. We have many witnesses who talk about individual events, and we know from other things that were happening elsewhere on the island, the Germans went to great lengths to hide their crimes, and therefore there are clearly records that no longer exist. And that's why we believe that the combination of historical and archaeological research is so important. And as a final point, before we just move on to the conclusion, then the end of the book culminates in a more detailed discussion than I'll have time to go into now. But this centres on the fact that the British government did know much more about the crimes perpetrated on Alderney than they ultimately revealed to the public. Not only did they initially uncover vast amounts of evidence about the crimes, which was later downplayed in public narratives of the events, but they actually knew about the camps, the deaths, and the fortifications that they were building as early as 1943 and possibly even earlier. And so we can see here on the screen a Home Forces map dating to 1943. And this was created on an Ordnance Survey map. And here we have the four main camps, Silt, Alderney, Borkum, and Helgoland, marked on these maps, even down to the individual number of buildings that were present at that given time. The British government were also, the intelligence agencies were also in possession of vast numbers of aerial photographs, many of which, as I mentioned, we subsequently analysed. And we know they don't analyse all of them, but we do know that they certainly analysed some of them, because we have what are called these Martian traces, where they annotated the fortifications, but also crucially marked the camps in these areas, and even again talk about the number of buildings that existed in these locations. So we know that they had these as well in 1943, 1944. And crucially, one of the major sources for us has been a British intelligence map, which was created by MI19, based on witness testimonies and analysis of aerial photography. And this map shows literally hundreds of sites that they documented, and with a very comprehensive key, and was accompanied by many reports of escaped inmates, for example, who'd left the island, or inmates that had been perhaps rescued elsewhere in France or in mainland Europe in 1944, particularly after D-Day, and were interviewed about their time on Alderney. So again, much more detail than I'm able to share now, but all of this information, and the fact, for example, that Helgoland and Alderney held Jewish prisoners, the fact that the other camps were taken over by the SS, for example, this was all known and documented in these records. And then in the conclusion of the book, we also talk about the journeys of the people after they left Alderney, because as I mentioned, many people had terrible journeys before they arrived. They had terrible times on the island and faced many atrocities. But then, unfortunately, many of them, when they were sent from the island, subsequently went on to be housed in many camps back in mainland Europe. And then also, sadly, many of those who did survive that ordeal were then subsequently repatriated. So, for example, the inmates who remained on Alderney until the 16th of May 1945 and who were located by the British liberators were taken to be interviewed. But many of them, if they were from Eastern Europe, for example, were then sent back to the Soviet Union, where many of them were then treated as traitors to the motherland, in the words of the Soviet government, for having worked for the Germans, even though, as I've already mentioned, that occurred under significant duress. And so many of these people were subsequently sent to the Gulag, and many didn't even know where Alderney was. They only knew of it as perhaps Adolf Island, or perhaps by some other name, or no name at all. And many of them were unable to speak about their experiences until after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so therefore, as many of those sources are now subsequently being declassified, and many of those people were subsequently able to speak, we're now utilising that, and of course have done in our research, to significant effect, to tell their stories of the lives as well that they had after they left Alderney. So to conclude, it's fair to say that Alderney represented a complex landscape of persecution, comprising of a diverse range of camps, other sites of internment and construction sites that responded to the needs of the fortification programme and Nazi ideology. The terrain itself became a vast construction site where the excavation of earth was coupled with the mixing and pouring of concrete, and all the accompanying sounds, smells and strains on the bodies of those who were forced to engage in these works. Fences were also erected, barracks built, and guard positions installed as temporary ad hoc camps, which were far more numerous than previously thought, and these came to exist alongside more permanent and oppressive sites of internment. By addressing the multiple phases of the camps and work sites, and by demonstrating the relationships between the experiences of the labourers and guards before and after their time spent on Alderney, we also aim to disprove the commonly held view that the island was an isolated place, that it was somehow unconnected to the wider system of forced and slave labour in Europe, a view that has served to both camouflage and facilitate forgetting of the events on Alderney in the past and the present. We've confirmed that Alderney did, in the words of historian Paul Sanders, provide the perfect laboratory for the implementation of many of the normative aspects of Nazi ideology. We see the universal oppression and objectification of Soviet citizens and Jews, the encouragement and rewarding of behaviours by the Guards, which limited the threat, in their words, that the so-called enemies posed to Germany, and the exploitation of people as tools for economic gain until their usefulness expired, when they were then subject to systematic killings, which ultimately resulted in their deaths and systematic ill treatment. We can't say, of course, that systematic killings are akin to places such as Auschwitz, Birkenau, Dachau, or Neuengamme were carried out in Alderney, but we can say that death by ill treatment were a constant through the occupation, and we do see instances of mass shooting and beatings and other forms of violence taking place. During the occupation, the camps governed by both the organisation TOD and SS did in fact also share many similarities in terms of architecture and the methods used to persecute the labourers who lived there. So it's also important to stress that things didn't just become atrocious on Alderney when the SS arrived, but there was a long history of ill treatment under the organisation TOD as well. And each of the camps was unique in its purpose and operations, and various phases in the lifespan of each one have been identified to provide a more nuanced insight into the evolution of the forced and slave labour programme, we hope. For the first time, as we said, many of the names of the victims who remain missing persons have been discovered, and we've shown hopefully that the bodies of hundreds of known and unidentified individuals were not recovered during the 1961 exhumations of the islands and official cemeteries, and that efforts to destroy documentation relating to deaths and burials and the use of clandestine approaches to body disposal suggest that the Germans didn't want the full death toll or the circumstances surrounding individual deaths on Alderney to be known. Unfortunately, given the focus and trajectory of post-liberation investigations, the illusion created by the cemeteries was extremely effective long after the Germans left the island. But non-invasive archaeological methods have, we hope, provided vital tools that have allowed these sites to be examined and characterised in more detail, and we hope this will continue in the future. It's impossible to confirm that the death toll was considerably higher than post-liberation investigations have suggested, and our estimations of between 701 and 896 deaths, as we said, is a conservative one that considers the spurious and imprecise nature of many of the records connected to the deaths and burials that occurred, but also the concrete evidence presented in a variety of sources. And as we've said, 600 individuals may well be missing. This number may well be higher, and the true death toll may be higher and may never be known. But we've now, as we've said, been able to say in concrete terms that people went to Alderney, they suffered terrible atrocities, they died there, and they've been buried in mass graves. So we do hope that you found this presentation and review of interest. We hope, of course, that many of you, if you've not done already, will pick up the book and obviously hopefully learn more about the people who were sent to Alderney and whose stories have been forgotten for more than 7 decades. And so it's in their honour that we speak. Tonight, it's in their honour that we do this research, and we hope the book has gone some way to contributing to their memory. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline and Kevin, for that tremendous overview of your book, and really showing the ways in which the combination of archaeology and historical research can result in such important findings. So thank you for that, and thank you for walking us through it. We do have some time, a little bit of time to take some questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat and I can convey those to Caroline. We've had one come from Ada, who is congratulating you both on the book and saying it's amazing work. And it's a loaded question. Do we dare ask what your next project is?
That's a good question. We've been working on Treblinka for many years, as we've already noted. So actually, at the moment, yes, I'm working on the manuscript for finding Treblinka. Is the manuscript to try and convey all the information that we've recorded over again a decade's worth of research. In fact, the work at Treblinka and Alderney both started at the same time, and both form part of my PhD research, because I wanted to demonstrate the breadth of the Holocaust and Nazi persecution, and also the ability to use forensic archaeological methods to reveal information about a very well-known site like Treblinka, and then a completely unknown site, really, such as Alderney in archaeological terms. So the two have run in parallel, but actually we made a conscious decision to prioritise writing Adolf Island, because we actually felt that this story really did need to be told sooner. As well, so so I can sort of blame that book in a way on why the Finding Treblinka one hasn't come out. But again, I think that's, as I say, that we felt that was really important to tell these stories now and as soon as possible.
Thank you. A question from Michael, who thanks you for your book and your research and for the informative talk. A question about testimony of George Pope, who was in Alderney for the whole period, a key witness. And whether his testimony was taken and confirmed, by MI19. And sorry, it's a bit of a long comment, so I'm just kind of trying to bring the gist. Also, the files he handed over to the British authorities, recorded by Major Panchev in his report summary, and confirmed by newspaper reports at the time. Have you been offered access to his files and testimony, or is it currently missing?
So we do have some of George Pope's testimony, and we have the notes as well that were taken by the British intelligence officers who interviewed him after the war. So George Pope's seen as quite a controversial character. He was, for those of you who aren't aware of Alderney's history, he was one of a few people who actually stayed on the island during the occupation. He was a British citizen. So when the British liberators arrived, he was very quick to go to them and to tell them that he believed that between 1,000 and 2,000 people had been murdered on the island. And he actually offered to give them a list of the names of the people that he believed to have been killed. Now, the British intelligence officers, they interviewed him, they took his testimony, and he was able to give some useful information about what happened on the island. He never, as far as we know, he never produced that list of 1,000 to 2,000 people. He handed over some of the German newspaper reports and some other documents, but that list didn't materialise. And in their notes, which are in the National Archives, the British liberators did view him with some degree of scepticism. I think they believed that he could have been a collaborator at that point. They didn't know to what extent his testimony was reliable. So his views and his comments on the number of deaths on the island have obviously got to be viewed cautiously, because of the fact that much of the information that he said was not ultimately verified. But obviously he was there, he was present on the island, and certainly in the book, I don't have time to go into all the sort of detail now. We've kind of footnoted some of the information, in particular about what comes from his testimony that can be deemed as reliable, and what perhaps we should view with more caution.
Thank you. Okay, I have a question from Jan. Thanks you for the fascinating presentation. How did wartime British intel agencies use the information they gathered about the detention sites on the island? Did they selectively publicize any of what they learned?
So no, not at first. So during the war, that information was all kept in-house. As soon as the island was liberated, and as I said, the liberators set foot on the island, one of the main gentleman in charge, Brigadier Snow, kind of professed that there would be a full and lengthy investigation into what happened in Alderney. He spoke in the press. There were lots of reports, like, for example, as I've just mentioned, George Pope, but there was other people, particularly other Channel Islanders who'd been incarcerated on Alderney, who spoke to the press and told of what they'd seen. So some of that information, was made public quite quickly. But then an initial investigation started, which was led by a gentleman called Major Haddock, and he started to uncover the atrocities. He started to talk about the fact that there could be mass graves, that excavations should take place, that these camps existed and they were quite atrocious. And there seemed at first to be kind of, an impetus to investigate. And then a gentleman called Captain Panchev took over. And again, in his initial reports, he documented many of the things I've just shared with you, and was very sort of open about the fact that these crimes were being committed. But then there's a very strange pivotal point where they're starting to talk about prosecutions. And literally you can see this shift in the space of a couple of letters, where they go from being very honest about what happened to then suddenly describing all the prisoners as Russian, to saying that nobody really suffered many atrocities, that the camps weren't that bad, and actually then handed the entire investigation over to the Russian, so the Soviets who obviously didn't do anything with that information, because their main interest in the prisoners, as I said, on Alderney, was to find out whether or not they were, that they'd be collaborators in their eyes with the Germans, and to get them back to the Soviet Union. So they didn't subsequently then publish it, and Panchev's reports, Haddock's reports, were classified for a very, very long time, and many copies of them were subsequently destroyed and aren't necessarily all contained within British archives. So there was definitely, we explain this more in the book, but there was definitely a shift and an attempt to hide that information and to not fully publicise it. And so all those Martian traces and intelligence reports and things were kept very, very quiet.
Thank you. I am aware that we are just over time, so I'm going to grab one more from the chat.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. If you don't mind, one from Tim. Thank you also for a fascinating talk. Wanted to ask more about the mass graves and the German exhumations in the early 1960s. Tim understands the German War Graves Commission moved the quote unquote Russian dead to France. Do you know why they were moved off of the island while the German military dead remained there? Was it easier for the British government to see them go?
So no, actually, this is a fascinating and very strange story. So in 1959, the British government signed the Anglo-German War Graves Agreement, which was an agreement to move all of what they called German war dead from British territory. So excavations started in a number of places where bodies of German, mainly service personnel, obviously, were taken, and they were subsequently buried in German military cemeteries at that time in France. And strangely, I don't know why on earth this decision was made, but unfortunately, the forced slave labourers who died on Alderney, either under the control of Organisation Todd or the SS, were also classed as German war dead at that point. So they were exhumed alongside the German military personnel on Alderney as well. So they were also taken back to the cemetery Mont-de-Husnis in France at the same time. So obviously this is, it's an incredibly controversial decision to class people who've actually been murdered by the German occupiers as German war dead, but sadly that is what happened. And these exhumation companies, the sort of exhumation teams that we used, we know from other documents that they were not thorough, that they didn't fully recover the remains properly. There were lots of complaints about them. And unfortunately, one of the things we don't have is their final exhumation report, which documents the exact number of people that were actually exhumed at that time. So again, we have secondary information that was published in Captain Panchev's book in the 1980s about that. But actually, we do, and various documents leading up to it, but we don't actually have their final exhumation report either. And the German War Graves Commission records on this are also very sparse. So unfortunately, in classing them as German war dead, a lot of vital information was lost, and we were very reliant on the Imperial War Graves Commission's lists from the cemeteries and other things like the death certificates, as I mentioned, and recover their names.
Okay, thank you for that. I think, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but what I will do is take the questions. I will try to download the chat transcript and send those to you, Caroline and Kevin, because we do have also some nice comments and not just questions congratulating you on your book. So I'd like to just hand over now to the director of the Wiener Holocaust Library, Dr. Toby Simpson, who's also here with us tonight to close out tonight's event.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you for giving me the opportunity just to say a big thank you to Caroline and Kevin too for an absolutely fascinating presentation. It was so thorough and wide-ranging. It was incredibly impressive. Also to see the techniques that you've used to discover vital new information about this subject. So I was so intrigued also by the other questions that you raised at the beginning, and I think that provokes us all to be excited about reading the book. And Christine did post, of course, the link to purchase the book in the thread, but anyone who isn't able to purchase the book, please do visit the library to read and find out the answers to the other questions that couldn't be covered in what was nevertheless a very thorough and wide-ranging presentation. So thank you so much to Caroline and Kevin, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I hope to see you at the library soon. Bye-bye. Good evening.
Bye. Thank you very much.